January 11, 1944. 27,000 feet above the frozen forests of Brunswick, Germany. The air at this altitude bites with a cold that no human body was designed to endure. Inside the aluminum belly of a B-24 Liberator. Tail number 42 to 7,576. Nicknamed Hell's Wrath. 10 men breathe through oxygen masks that frost with each exhalation. The aircraft shudders as flak bursts pepper the sky around them, creating dark clouds of shrapnel that bloom and fade like deadly flowers. Through the plexiglass nose, Bombardier Lieutenant James Hendricks can see the lead aircraft dropping their payloads. In moments, it will be their turn. The industrial complexes below, churning out aircraft components for the Luftwaffe, spread across the landscape like iron tumors on the Earth's skin. The mission briefing that morning had been clear. Destroy the factories, cripple production, accept losses. Always accept losses. The formation is tight, 56 heavy bombers arranged in combat boxes, a geometric expression of American industrial might translated into aluminum and ordnance. Each aircraft carries nearly 8,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs. Each crew carries something heavier, the knowledge that statistically, they have a 1 in 4 chance of completing their 25-mission tour. The waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Mike Torres and Staff Sergeant Eddie Kaminsky, stand at their posts, hands wrapped around .50 caliber machine guns that protrude from the fuselage like the quills of a mechanical porcupine. The guns are cold. In moments, they will be scorching hot. Below them, the ball turret gunner, Sergeant Ray Morrison, sits cramped in his rotating sphere of plexiglass and steel, suspended beneath the aircraft like a man trapped in a transparent egg. Nothing between him and the earth but thin glass and 5 miles of empty air. What these men do not yet know is that in the next 10 minutes, they will become ghosts who refuse to die. They will become the story that Luftwaffe pilots tell in disbelief. They will become the crew that should not have survived, but did. The philosophy of strategic bombing rested on a simple but terrible arithmetic. By January 1944, the United States Army Air Forces had committed to a doctrine of daylight precision bombing, a strategy that British commanders privately considered suicidal. The RAF had abandoned daylight raids after suffering catastrophic losses in 1940, retreating to the cover of darkness where accuracy suffered but survival improved. The Americans, however, believed in a different calculus. Their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were designed as flying battleships, bristling with defensive armament, up to 13.50 caliber machine guns per aircraft. The theory held that properly organized formations could create interlocking fields of fire so dense that enemy fighters would be shredded before they could press home their attacks. The theory was elegant. Reality was significantly messier. The cost of this doctrine was measured in young men who never came home. Over the skies of Germany in the winter of 1943-44, the 8th Air Force was bleeding. Mission after mission, bombers failed to return. Entire crews vanished into the clouds or plummeted earthward trailing smoke. The replacement crews arrived at English airfields with fresh faces and clean uniforms, and within weeks they too were listed as missing in action. The average life expectancy of a B-24 crew member operating over Germany during this period was 15 missions. Most never reached 10. The 8th Air Force was engaged in a campaign of attrition it could barely afford, trading American lives and expensive aircraft for damage to German industrial capacity. The strategic question was whether Germany's war machine would break before America's will to continue the bombing campaign collapsed. Hell's Wrath had already flown 9 missions. By the brutal mathematics of aerial warfare, they were veterans. Their pilot, Captain Robert Dutch Schultz, was 23 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man twice that age. War ages you in ways that have nothing to do with time. Co-pilot Lieutenant William Hayes was even younger, fresh-faced despite everything, still carrying a photograph of a girl named Sarah who waited for him in Kansas and wrote letters that smelled faintly of lavender. Navigator Lieutenant Frank Morrison calculated their position with the precision of a mathematician solving an equation where the wrong answer meant death. Engineer Technical Sergeant Paul Richards monitored engine temperatures and fuel consumption, translating the language of gauges into decisions about survival. Radio Operator Technical Sergeant Charlie Wells maintained contact with the formation and command, though increasingly the radio carried only static and the desperate calls of crippled aircraft falling behind. They were ordinary men assembled by circumstance into a crew bound by the knowledge that their survival depended entirely on each other. No one could do this alone. In a B-24 over Germany, individualism was a luxury no one could afford. Each man's competence was the foundation of every other man's life. The Luftwaffe fighters appeared at 11:37 hours, emerging from the sun like hunting hawks. Intelligence had predicted moderate fighter opposition. Intelligence was wrong. What fell upon the bomber stream that morning was a concentrated fury of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, some bearing the markings of elite Jagdgeschwader units whose pilots had been killing American bombers for years. These were not novices. These were experienced Jagdflieger who knew exactly where a B-24 was vulnerable, who had memorized the blind spots in its defensive coverage, who had studied the American formations and learned to exploit their weaknesses. They came in waves, attacking from the nose where the bomber's forward firepower was lightest, or diving from 12 o'clock high where the closure rate gave gunners only seconds to track and fire. The German tactical approach was refined through years of bitter experience. A frontal attack on a B-24 required precise timing and absolute nerve. The fighter pilot would aim his aircraft directly at the bomber's nose, machine guns and cannon blazing, holding his course until the last possible moment before breaking away. For those seconds, both aircraft were committed to a collision course, and whoever flinched first lost. Many German pilots did not flinch. They would press attacks to within 200 yards, sometimes closer, accepting the risk of collision or being hit by defensive fire in exchange for the certainty of devastating the target. A 2-second burst from a Focke-Wulf's cannon could saw a bomber's wing off. The Germans knew this. The Americans knew this. Everyone knew the rules of this terrible game. Hell's Wrath was flying in the low squadron of the formation, a position known grimly as Purple Heart Corner, because it was most vulnerable to fighter attack. When the first wave struck, Bombardier Hendricks watched a fighter materialize from the bright haze ahead, growing from a speck to a deadly silhouette in heartbeats. He pressed the firing button on his nose gun, watching tracers reach out toward the attacking fighter like bright threads trying to sow death across the sky. The fighter's wings lit up with muzzle flashes. The world became noise and violence and the hammer-blow impacts of cannon shells punching through aluminum. The plexiglass nose starred with cracks. Something hot whipped past Hendricks' head close enough to feel. The fighter flashed overhead, so close he could see details. The Balkenkreuz on the wings, the pilot's leather helmet, the streaking passage of something moving too fast for human reaction. In the top turret, Sergeant Johnny Rodriguez tracked the fighter as it climbed away, leading it with his twin 50s, watching his tracers walk across the sky toward the diving aircraft. A burst of black smoke erupted from the Focke-Wulf's engine cowling. The fighter rolled inverted and began its long fall toward the forests below. Rodriguez didn't celebrate. There was no time. 2 more fighters were already positioning for their attack runs. On the radio, someone was screaming that they were hit and going down. The formation tightened reflexively, the surviving bombers drawing closer together like a herd contracting before predators. What the German pilots expected was what they had seen in dozens of previous engagements: the progressive destruction of an American bomber. The standard attack profile had been validated by combat experience. Hit them hard and hit them fast. Knock out engines, kill the pilots, shatter the formations. Once a bomber fell out of position, separated from the protective guns of its neighbors, it became easy prey for follow-up attacks. A damaged bomber was a dead bomber. It was only a question of how long the dying took. The Luftwaffe pilots that morning saw Hell's Wrath take multiple hits in the first pass and assumed the outcome was determined. They had seen this scenario unfold countless times. The bomber would slow, begin trailing smoke, gradually lose altitude. The crew would bail out or ride it down. Either way, it would be another kill mark painted on a fighter's fuselage, another American crew removed from the war. But Hell's Wrath did not behave as expected. The bomber shuddered under the impacts, absorbed the damage, and kept flying. His guns never stopped firing. When a Messerschmitt 109 attempted to position for a beam attack on the right side, Waistgunner Torres tracked it smoothly, leading the target with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to judge deflection angles at closing speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. His burst caught the fighter at the wing root. The Messerschmitt cartwheeled violently and broke apart, pieces tumbling through the slipstream of the bomber formation like leaves scattered by a metal wind. In the ball turret, Morrison rotated his transparent cage to face a fighter coming up from below, the classic Luftwaffe tactic of attacking from the bomber's vulnerable belly. Morrison's twin guns hammered, the recoil shaking his entire turret. The fighter broke off its attack, trailing smoke. Morrison couldn't confirm whether it was destroyed or merely damaged, but it was no longer a threat. In aerial combat, removing a threat was success enough. Confirmation was a luxury for after-action reports. The attacks continued. 3 fighters. 4. 5. The crew of Hell's Wrath fell into the rhythm of combat. That strange state where terror transforms into intense focus and time seems to dilate. Each man existed in his own universe of responsibility, a sector of sky that was his alone to defend. Together, those sectors formed a sphere of protective fire around the aircraft. Break the sphere at any point and death would pour through the gap. The coordination was instinctive now, honed by previous missions and the absolute understanding that failure meant extinction. Technical Sergeant Paul Richards, monitoring the engines from his station, saw the number 3 engine temperature spike into the red. One of the earlier attacks had damaged something, coolant line, oil line, some critical system that kept the engine from tearing itself apart. He made the decision without consulting the pilot. Engine 3 was shut down, the propeller feathered to reduce drag. Hell's Wrath now flew on 3 engines, still holding position in the formation through Captain Schultz's sheer skill at the controls. The bomber was designed to limp home on 2 engines if necessary, though 3 was far preferable. What it could not easily do was maintain formation speed and altitude on 3 engines while continuing to carry a full bomb load into the target. Schultz's voice came over the intercom, calm despite everything. They would continue to the target. They would drop their bombs. They would complete the mission. The crew did not question this. They understood the logic even if they didn't like it. Turning back now, damaged and alone, would make them easy prey for every fighter in the area. Their only safety lay in staying with the formation, in the mutual protection of massed guns. Individual survival depended on collective commitment. Anyone who broke from the formation for personal safety endangered everyone else. The bomb run required the aircraft to fly straight and level for what felt like an eternity but was actually 90 seconds. 90 seconds during which the bombers could not maneuver, could not take evasive action, had to maintain course and altitude, while flak batteries below pumped shells into the sky and fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury. 90 seconds when the bombardier owned the aircraft, controlling it through his bomb sight, making minute adjustments to align the crosshairs on the target. 90 seconds of being a flying target, trusting that mathematics and luck would see them through. Hendricks, bent over his Norden bomb sight, tuned out everything except the industrial buildings sliding into his crosshairs. The mathematics of ballistics became his entire world: wind speed, altitude, airspeed, trajectory. The bombs fell away with a physical sensation the crew could feel, the aircraft lifting suddenly as tons of weight departed. "Bombs away," Hendricks called, and Schultz immediately banked the aircraft away from the target, finally free to maneuver again. But the Luftwaffe was not finished. 6 more fighters converged on Hell's Wrath as it turned for home, drawn to the damaged bomber like sharks to blood in water. The crew could see other bombers in the formation streaming smoke, falling out of position, beginning their terminal descents. The sky was full of parachutes and burning aircraft and the black smudges of flak that continued to blossom even as the formation left the target area. The return flight would be over 400 miles of hostile territory, every mile an opportunity for fighters to intercept them. A Focke-Wulf came in from 7 o'clock low, climbing toward the bomber's tail. Tail gunner Sergeant Rick Lawson, isolated in his position at the aircraft's rear extremity, saw it coming and opened fire at maximum range. The .50 caliber rounds arced out in brilliant tracer streams. The fighter jinked, its pilot trying to throw off the gunner's aim. But Lawson anticipated the move and adjusted his fire. The fighter pilot made a fatal error. He pressed the attack just a fraction too long. Lawson's burst stitched across the fighter's canopy and engine. The Focke-Wulf snap-rolled and dove away vertically, already burning. 2 Messerschmitts attempted a coordinated attack from both sides simultaneously, trying to split the defensive fire. Torres and Kaminsky, the waist gunners, each took a target. The cramped waist compartment filled with the deafening hammering of the machine guns, with the stink of cordite and hot metal, with spent shell casings cascading onto the floor. Torres' target broke off, trailing smoke. Kaminsky's fighter exploded in a brilliant flash, either a direct hit on its fuel tank or ammunition storage. The Messerschmitt became an expanding cloud of debris and fire that the bomber flew through seconds later, fragments rattling against the fuselage. In the top turret, Rodriguez tracked another fighter as it climbed away after a head-on pass. His guns hammered out another burst. The fighter shuddered, rolled, and began its long descent, trailing fire and black smoke. That was 7. 7 fighters destroyed or driven off in 10 minutes of sustained combat. The odds of this were astronomical. B-24 gunners typically claimed 1 or 2 fighters per mission, if that. Claims were often optimistic. The chaos of combat made confirmation nearly impossible. But this was different. Multiple crew members had witnessed each kill. The fighters had fallen within sight of the formation. There would be no dispute about these claims. What the crew of Hell's Wrath could not know was that they were creating a legend that would spread through both air forces. In the Luftwaffe debriefing rooms that evening, surviving pilots would report an encounter with a bomber that seemed impossible to kill, whose defensive fire was lethally accurate, whose crew fought with a coordination and skill that defied their understanding. The intelligence officers would note the reports and file them, adding another data point to the growing realization that the American strategic bombing campaign could not be stopped by fighters alone. The mathematics were turning against Germany. For every bomber the Luftwaffe destroyed, America built 3 more. For every experienced German pilot lost, there was no replacement. Germany's training pipeline had been reduced to a trickle by fuel shortages and attrition. The Americans, by contrast, had an apparently inexhaustible supply of crews and aircraft. The industrial advantage that Germany had once held over its enemies in 1940 had reversed completely. Now it was Germany that faced material exhaustion while its enemies grew stronger with each passing month. For the crew of Hell's Wrath, the immediate concern was more basic: survival. They had fought through the worst of the fighter attacks, but they still had to navigate back to England on 3 engines with battle damage that made the aircraft handle like a truck with a broken axle. Fuel consumption had increased. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. The oxygen system showed signs of damage. Navigator Morrison plotted the most direct course home, calculating fuel reserves against distance, running the numbers repeatedly to ensure they weren't missing anything. The margin of error was thin. They flew through the afternoon, watching the coastline of occupied Europe slowly approach. Other bombers from the formation had fallen behind or diverted to emergency fields. The formation that had numbered 56 aircraft over the target now consisted of 41 aircraft limping toward England across the North Sea. 15 bombers lost, each carrying 10 men. 150 young Americans who had eaten breakfast that morning and would never eat dinner. The cost of strategic bombing was always counted in empty bunks and footlockers that would be shipped home to families who would never fully understand how their sons or husbands or brothers had died. The symbolic weight of that day's mission extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Hell's Wrath represented something the German High Command had not anticipated when they planned their defense of the Reich. The Americans were not simply throwing bombers and crews into the meat grinder of aerial combat. They were learning, adapting, improving. The crews that survived their early missions became increasingly difficult to kill. Their gunnery improved. Their formation discipline tightened. Their coordination reached levels that made each bomber a far more dangerous opponent than German tactical planning had assumed. The doctrine of the self-defending bomber formation, which had seemed so naive in the face of Luftwaffe experience, was beginning to work, not perfectly, not without terrible cost, but well enough to sustain the campaign. Moreover, the B-24 itself, often maligned as inferior to the more famous B-17, had proven in this engagement that properly crewed and properly defended, it could absorb extraordinary punishment and continue fighting. The aircraft that should have been torn from the sky had instead become an instrument of German defeat. Each fighter that fell to Hell's Wrath's guns was not merely a tactical victory, but a strategic subtraction from Germany's dwindling fighter strength. The Luftwaffe was being ground down, not by any single catastrophic defeat, but by the cumulative attrition of missions like this one, repeated day after day, week after week, until the mathematics of survival turned decisively against the defenders. Captain Schultz brought Hell's Wrath across the English coast at 15,000 feet, significantly below their outbound altitude but high enough to clear the coastal hills. The crew could see the patchwork fields of East Anglia spread below them, peaceful and green and utterly divorced from the mechanical violence they had just experienced. The contrast was jarring. One world where men tried to murder each other with high-velocity metal at 5 miles altitude, another where farmers tended crops and villages slept undisturbed. Both worlds existed simultaneously, separated by altitude and circumstance, but sharing the same sky. The landing was difficult. The damaged hydraulics meant limited control over flaps and landing gear. Schultz brought the aircraft down with the skill of a man who had learned to fly wounded bombers through sheer necessity. The B-24 touched down hard, bounced once, settled, and rolled to a stop at the end of the runway. Ground crew rushed to meet them, faces showing shock at the visible damage. The shattered plexiglass, the cannon shell holes, the torn aluminum, the feathered propeller. That this aircraft had made it home seemed impossible. That its crew had survived seemed miraculous. But there was nothing miraculous about it. What brought Hell's Wrath home was training, skill, coordination, and the collective refusal of 10 men to accept death. They had performed exactly as their training demanded, executing the defensive tactics they had practiced, supporting each other with the teamwork that was drilled into every crew during their months of preparation. The German pilots they faced were experienced and brave, but experience and bravery were not enough when confronted with systematic discipline and overwhelming material superiority. The Luftwaffe was fighting a defensive war of attrition it could not win. Every day, the arithmetic grew worse for Germany. Every mission pushed the Reich closer to collapse, not through any single decisive blow, but through the relentless accumulation of incremental destruction. In the debriefing room, the crew of Hell's Wrath recounted their mission to intelligence officers who filled out forms in triplicate and asked precise questions about fighter types, attack angles, results of defensive fire. The crew's claims of 7 fighters destroyed would be investigated, cross-referenced with other crew reports, evaluated by gun camera footage where available. In this case, the claims would be confirmed. 7 fighters destroyed, several more damaged and driven off, in 10 minutes of sustained combat. The intelligence officers exchanged glances. This was exceptional. This was the kind of mission that would be written up, that would be mentioned in communiques, that would become a story told to new crews as example and inspiration. But for the crew themselves, the immediate emotion was not pride but exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained them through combat was draining away, leaving behind only the bone-deep weariness that comes after surviving something that should have killed you. They had one more mission to their credit. 16 more to go before completing their tour, assuming they lived that long. The odds remained against them. Statistical survival was not guaranteed. Other crews would not be as lucky. The next mission might be the one where their luck ran out. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Word of Hell's Wrath's combat performance spread through the bomber group stationed in England. The crew became minor celebrities, their achievement recognized as exceptional even among the daily heroism that characterized the 8th Air Force's operations. More importantly, their success validated the American doctrine of strategic bombing. The mission had not been a suicide run. It had been a successful application of tactical principles: formation integrity, mutual support, accurate defensive gunnery, and the determination to complete the mission regardless of opposition. These principles, repeated across hundreds of bombers and thousands of missions, would eventually break the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. The larger strategic truth was becoming apparent by early 1944. Germany was losing the air war, not through any single catastrophic defeat, but through the gradual erosion of its fighter strength and industrial capacity. The American bombing campaign, sustained despite terrible losses, was achieving its objective. German aircraft production was being disrupted. German fuel supplies were being targeted. German transportation networks were being systematically destroyed. The defensive fighters that Germany desperately needed to protect its cities and industries were being forced into unwinnable battles of attrition against bomber streams that grew larger and more difficult to defeat with each passing month. Hell's Wrath flew 19 more missions before the war ended. The crew survived. Not all crews were so fortunate, but this crew made it. They returned to America, to families and futures, carrying with them the memory of that January morning when they became the bomber that refused to die. Their achievement was recorded in after-action reports, in official histories, in the dry statistical compilations that transformed human experience into data points for future historians to analyze. But the real meaning of that mission lay elsewhere, in something harder to quantify. It lay in the demonstration that ordinary men, properly trained and equipped, could stand against experienced killers and prevail. It lay in the validation of collective action over individual heroism. No single crew member had won that battle, but the crew as a functioning unit had dominated the engagement. It lay in the manifestation of American industrial and organizational capacity translated into combat effectiveness. 10 men in a mass-produced bomber had destroyed 7 fighters and survived when every tactical consideration suggested they should have been annihilated. This was the arithmetic that ultimately defeated Germany, not the isolated heroics of individuals, but the systematic application of material superiority and tactical discipline across thousands of missions. The Luftwaffe pilots who attacked Hell's Wrath that morning were brave and skilled. They fought according to their training and pressed their attacks with the courage born of defending their homeland. But courage was not enough when facing an enemy who could absorb losses, learn from failure, and return stronger each time. The United States could build bombers faster than Germany could destroy them. America could train crews faster than Germany could kill them. The mathematics of attrition, which had favored Germany in the early years of the war, had irreversibly shifted. In the cold equations of strategic warfare, Hell's Wrath represented a data point in a larger trend. But for the men who flew in that aircraft on January 11, 1944, it was the day they discovered something about themselves they had not known before. They discovered that when faced with death, when the odds were impossible, when every rational calculation suggested failure, they could still function. They could still fight. They could still win. This knowledge, this confidence born of tested competence, was as much a weapon as the .50 caliber machine guns they fired. The sky over Brunswick that morning had been a geometry of violence, a three-dimensional battlefield where physics and courage intersected at lethal velocities. But it was also a proving ground for our idea that democracy's strength lay not in the exceptional individual but in the competent collective. The crew of Hell's Wrath were not supermen. They were farmers' sons and factory workers, small-town boys and city kids, united by circumstance and training into something greater than the sum of their individual parts. They represented the democratization of competence, the idea that ordinary citizens, given proper preparation, could master complex tasks and defeat professional warriors. This concept was anathema to the authoritarian ideologies they fought against. German military doctrine emphasized elite formations and individual heroism. The Luftwaffe's best pilots accumulated enormous scores of kills, and these aces were celebrated as superior beings, warriors whose prowess elevated them above common men. The American approach was different, less romantic but ultimately more effective. American doctrine emphasized standardized training, mass production, and the replacement of individual brilliance with systematic competence. Any crew could be Hell's Wrath if properly trained and equipped. Excellence was not innate but manufactured through preparation and practice. The evidence was written in the formation counts, in the bombers that kept coming despite losses, in the progressive destruction of German industry, in the gradual but inexorable advance of Allied armies supported by air forces that Germany could no longer effectively contest. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had largely abandoned daylight operations over Germany. The sky belonged to the Americans and British. The strategic bombing campaign, which had seemed so costly and questionable in its early phases, had achieved air superiority. The price had been terrible: thousands of aircraft lost, tens of thousands of aircrew killed or captured, but the objective had been attained. Hell's Wrath completed its final mission in April 1945, as Germany collapsed. The aircraft was retired, eventually scrapped, its aluminum recycled into some peacetime purpose. The crew dispersed to their separate lives, carrying with them the bond forged in shared danger. They would meet occasionally at reunions, growing older, watching their extraordinary experience become history, then distant history, then ancient history as generations passed who had no living memory of that war. The details of individual missions faded with time, but the essential truth remained. They had been tested and had not been found wanting. In the vast historiography of World War II, the mission of January 11, 1944, appears as a footnote, remarkable but not decisive in the strategic sense. The war was won by millions of such missions, thousands of crews, countless individual acts of courage and competence aggregated into overwhelming force. No single mission changed the war's outcome. But each mission, each crew, each successful return contributed to the cumulative weight that eventually crushed the Third Reich. The symbolic resonance of Hell's Wrath's survival lies not in exceptionalism but in representation. The crew represented what democracies could achieve when aroused to total war, the mobilization of ordinary citizens into extraordinary effectiveness through systematic training and material support. They were proof that free societies, often dismissed as soft or decadent by their authoritarian opponents, could produce warriors as capable and determined as any in history. The difference was that democratic warriors fought not for glory or conquest but for the right to return to ordinary lives of liberty and peace. The sky remembers nothing. The air through which Hell's Wrath fought is the same air through which commercial jets now pass, carrying tourists and businessmen who have no awareness of the battles fought in that space 8 decades ago. The cities that the bomber stream targeted have been rebuilt, their factories converted to peaceful production or abandoned entirely. The veterans who fought that air campaign have nearly all passed from life into memory. The B-24s have long since vanished, reduced to aluminum ingots and recycled into automobiles and appliances and the mundane infrastructure of peacetime existence. But the truth that Hell's Wrath demonstrated remains valid. That ordinary people, united in common purpose and properly equipped, can overcome forces that seem overwhelming. That competence and coordination can triumph over individual brilliance when systematically applied. That the strength of democracy lies not in exceptional heroes but in the collective capacity of free citizens to rise to necessity. These truths transcend their specific historical moment. They speak to something fundamental about human capability and social organization. On January 11, 1944, 10 men in a damaged bomber chose to keep fighting when surrender or flight would have been rational responses. They did so because their training, their bonds with each other, and their commitment to their mission overrode the natural human instinct for self-preservation. They became, for those 10 minutes over Brunswick, an embodiment of the principle that individuals are weak but collectives are strong, that isolated courage is futile but coordinated action is overwhelming. The German fighters that fell that morning fell not to superior individual skill but to systematic discipline applied by ordinary men who had been taught to function as a unit. This was the lesson that democratic societies had to learn in order to defeat ideologies built on hierarchy and dominance. Excellence could be taught. Courage could be trained. Victory was not the province of exceptional individuals but the product of collective competence. This is the legacy that Hell's Wrath left in the cold air over Germany. Not a story of miracle or providence, but a testament to what ordinary humans can achieve when necessity demands and preparation allows. The bomber that couldn't be killed, the crew that wouldn't die, became a symbol of something larger than themselves. They became evidence that the democratic experiment, whatever its peacetime inefficiencies, could produce warriors capable of defeating any threat. They proved that freedom was not weakness but strength, that the voluntary cooperation of equal citizens could generate combat effectiveness that exceeded what could be extracted through coercion and hierarchy. In the end, this was why Germany lost the air war and ultimately the greater conflict. Not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the industrial and organizational systems of democratic capitalism could produce overwhelming material superiority when fully mobilized. The crew of Hell's Wrath was a manifestation of that superiority, not in any single individual quality, but in their collective training, equipment, support structure, and determination. They were ordinary men made extraordinary by the system that prepared them and the cause for which they fought. The sky above Brunswick is empty now of everything except the wind and commercial traffic. The crews who fought there have joined the silence. But the truth they demonstrated endures. that when free people choose to fight, when they coordinate their efforts and support each other with discipline and determination, they become a force that tyranny cannot ultimately defeat. This was the lesson written in fire and steel at 27,000 feet on a frozen January morning, when Hell's Wrath refused to fall and 10 men proved that democracy's children could be warriors as fierce and skilled as any the world had known. Their names are recorded in histories and databases. Their achievement is documented in after-action reports. But their real monument is the peace that their war helped secure, the decades of prosperity and liberty that followed the defeat of fascism. They fought so that others would not have to. They risked everything so that future generations could live in safety. This is the ultimate meaning of their survival that day. Not that they were special, but that they were representative of millions who served and sacrificed. They were ordinary citizens who answered when called, performed when tested, and returned, when fortune allowed, to the ordinary lives they had fought to preserve. The bomber that couldn't be killed. The crew that wouldn't die. Their story survives as evidence that liberty, properly defended, cannot be extinguished by those who worship only power.